So I don't have a problem with single groups, and I get that people want to be with people like them, but I think we have to kind of keep first principles in front of us,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you walk into a church and your first question is there a singles group for me?
Mm-hmm.
I would suggest that you've lost the plot.
Mm-hmm. Hey friends, here we are for this week's culture segment, and you know that usually this segment is, some kind of author, theologian, artist, influencer, and it's really my privilege to get to know folks and kind of give you their wisdom on any number of topics. And so today, this one is actually born out of a question we had from one of you, and so I invited two pastors to the table to basically answer this question and have a little discussion around it because you know that I give hot takes on this all the time, but I figured I'd probably better bring in some more objective voices on this and talk from the other side. So I have got our dear friend, Pastor Mark Bates here. Mark, good to have you back.
It's good to be here. Thanks, Lisa.
Awesome. In addition to being a pastor, a church planter, all the things, he is Senior Director of U.S. Operations for Mission to the World, which is the missions arm of the Presbyterian Church in America. He's also my former pastor. Until I just fired him. I said, y'all, get him out of here. No, I'm just teasing. But he recommended our other friend, new to the Boundless show, Pastor Matthew Capone. Matthew, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having
Very
me,
good
Lisa.
to have you. Also a pastor, in fact, here in Colorado Springs of Cheyenne Mountain Presbyterian Church. And this is kind of fun. You are a theological review board member for Tapestry Worship. So
That's correct.
this is like people who care about the theology of worship songs. So that's pretty good. I mean, who knew? I thought that was just a free-for-all. So no, it's important. So, but we're going to have a conversation today on really this topic of churches, and I don't want to call it like singles versus marrieds. That sounds a little aggressive. A little bit, but I feel like there's a frustration among listeners to the Boundless show, especially those who are single. And we are actually in a culture now that is right at about 50% single in the US adult population. And that doesn't necessarily mean that people aren't living together or people aren't divorced or maybe widowed or whatever, but functionally, like as far as a piece of paper, single, we're at about 50%. And many folks in our churches are single as well. Everyone here listening, most of y'all, unless you're listening today for the first time, know that I'm single. And so lifetime single. So anyway, let's start first of all by, I just want to ask you guys kind of for a general summary of your experience in the church as pastors and beyond, with single adults in your churches. And I know there've been a variety of experiences. So how they've involved single adult ministries, and also in that, what would you say are some of the stereotypes about singles that you've experienced or you've heard or you've been, argued with about? I don't know. Go ahead, Mark, you can start.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so
Mark is not single.
I'm not single, married, children and grandkid. Yeah, so my wife and I actually met in a singles group at a
Okay.
church, and so loved that. It was a great place for community for us. And fellowship was a large church, so it was a place where you can meet people who were free to do things on the weekend and other things. So it was a great time of life. And then my first job after seminary, I was a singles pastor at a church, and it was started off as a very small group. It grew to a large group, and the first started off, it was all the stereotypes
Mhm.
of people who were mostly introverted, socially awkward, and the group that nobody wanted to be a part of,
Mhm.
to be honest. And yet God moved, and we saw a number of people come to Christ, and it was the most fun, exciting ministry in the church, in my opinion.
Mhm.
And because these were people who were reaching out to their friends, and so that was our experience then. And then since then, I've been a pastor of church, of course, had singles in it, but yeah, not in most places. The singles were not a large part of the ministry.
Okay. All right. Matthew.
So I am single, so I have some skin in the game, and never married. I've been at the church I'm at now for the last 8 years, and we are very intergenerational. So people have asked me recently, hey, are we growing younger? And I said, well, we're growing younger and we're growing older. So we have everything. We have new kids being born to young families. We have singles. Last year, our oldest member died at 102 years old.
Wow.
So we have the whole span. We don't have a singles ministry per se. Our goal is that everyone has a place to connect, both in worship and in small groups. And I think it is important to remember as we talk about these things, especially with programming, is that your average church in America is less than 100 people. So your average church in America is doing well just to have one pastor. They're doing well to have their main program, which is Sunday morning worship. And I think that's true of a lot of us. In terms of prejudice against singles, that's kind of the word I would use. I think I probably come up against different stereotypes than Mark has. I think the stereotype I have an axe to grind around maybe is just this idea that if someone's single, they must be less mature. So if we're looking at people for leadership roles in the church, of course, we're looking at married people. And if you've spent any time with married people, you know that married people and single people can be incredibly immature.
Yeah.
Neither one
Yeah.
is really a test of
Right.
where someone can fit in terms of Christian service.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Mm.
So what would you guys say to, the single who's going to come up to you, or maybe, ply your ear or whatever, about this assumption that, man, why aren't churches quote unquote for singles? Like, any church I go to, whether it's smaller or bigger, they're going to have like a marriage ministry, or they're going to have VBS, they're going to have kids programs, they're going to have, a getaway weekend, or some kind of, speakers coming in to talk about this or talk about that. But it doesn't seem like, I think, Mark, what you're sharing of like meeting in a singles group, very few churches program for that anymore. And they certainly, if they're going to cut something, it's going to be a young adults pastor or a singles pastor or something along those lines. So what do you think that that's just kind of where the culture has been, or the culture of the church of like marriage is kind of preeminent and, for good or for ill?
Yeah, I think the church, obviously, we're a pro-marriage institution, and so that and pro family, appropriate as we're talking here at the Focus on the Family Studios. So it's
Exactly.
so I think there's certainly that strong bias, and then what happens though, I think there's in leadership, and as Matthew pointed out, oftentimes churches look to married people for leadership, and people tend to think about that people think like them. So you have a bunch of married men in the room. They think like a bunch of married men. They're not thinking about single people. So some of it is just oversight, omission, and because they're thinking about themselves. Just like you have a bunch of married men in the room, they don't always think about women. That can be a huge blind spot as well. So I think that's certainly one of the causes.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'd go back first to what I said earlier, which is that when we talk about churches with all these different ministries, kids ministries, young adults ministries, marriage and family, we are talking about the minority of churches. That your average American church just has one full-time staff member, and they're doing good just to have Sunday morning worship. So I think it's helpful to keep that in perspective as we talk about these things. In Colorado Springs, we're highly mobile, and so I talk to folks who've left our city for other cities. And recently I heard from a couple who said, hey, we didn't realize how spoiled we were in Colorado Springs with the options of churches and the ministries and all those things.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what Mark is saying is correct, right? We are a pro-family, pro-marriage institution. We do have a special responsibility to raise up our youth and our children. I think of Deuteronomy chapter 6. So there is a responsibility. The church has special responsibility in that direction that I don't want to, undermine. And I think that is part of the bias. I think there's also an idea that, whether you agree with it or not, I've heard from church leaders that, families are really the stability of our church. Now, whether you believe that's true or not is a whole other conversation, but that's at least the perception, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And so I would put that under the category of prejudice of, if we really want a strong church, we focus on the families because they're going to be the foundation, the building block. And then all these other pieces, well, they're going to come along, and whether they are the foundation or not is neither here nor there.
Yeah. And I do think there are many places where single adults have contributed to, probably some negative conversations within the church. And I always say, to my fellow singles, like, hey, don't be that angry, weird, bitter person, because how's that going to help any kind of cause? And clearly we're all showing up as brothers and sisters in Christ first and foremost, and we don't have to draw lines, too distinctly once we get past that. But that said, I think that there are some, so many singles will say, yeah, well, they want me to plug in, but it's usually like helping with Awana or can you watch when we do the marriage conference, can you watch all the kids or whatever, rather than seeing, as Matthew said, seeing single adults. And I'm talking about, I'm not talking about high school and college, kids. I'm talking about the 30 something that probably could be on the finance committee because they're a CPA, and it's like we got to call them out and equip them and invite them maybe to be part of the process. That said, I do want to ask your opinion on addressing singleness in the church. And do you think that a young adult, say today, because again, we're talking here at Boundless, we know statistically that 30% of Gen Z will not be married by 40.
Mm.
Now, some of that is I don't think that's a problem that we can solve by just being like, hey, everyone, get married so you can legitimize yourself or be more like Jesus or whatever. Sometimes marriage will make you more like Jesus, but quite frankly, singleness should too. So, but that said, do you think that a single adult should specifically be called to singleness or celibate service as far as, when we're looking at what scripture calls us to? Or do you think a young adult who's just not 100% sure, they don't have their footing, or there's this gray area of just, what do I do? How do I be faithful to Jesus in the meantime?
Hmm. It reminds me, I had a single pastor when I was in high school, and he was approaching 50, and he said one time, "I think the Lord's calling me to take on a wife." And I always thought, well, how are you going to do that? But, it's like he didn't feel called to singleness, but God called him to singleness because there was never an opportunity otherwise. So I think too, just recognize that God does call some people, like the Apostle Paul, to celibacy. And other people, he calls the singleness not necessarily because it's something they desire. It's just, we live in a world where things just don't match up perfectly.
Mhm.
There are couples, people who would love to have children who can't have children,
Mhm.
and other people who are just quite comfortable being single. So I don't know if I'd want to lump every single person into the same category of why they're single. But for the time that God's called them to that status, to recognize that and say, okay, what does this mean? How should I live with this?
Mhm.
I do think you alluded to something. There's a tendency of the church to then make assumptions about singles that are unfair. I see this in the agency I work for a missions agency, and so we have a lot of single missionaries. And married couples say, "Oh, it's easier on you because you're single, you don't have family responsibilities." You go, "Oh, yeah, you've got someone to do your laundry, to do, you share your workload around the house. I don't have anybody to do that." Or,
Yeah.
"Oh, you're single, you can come watch the kids
Yeah.
for us," as if, they don't have other burdens. And so I think that is a narrative we need to
Yeah.
to
It
squelch.
reminds me of, and I think I put this illustration in my book about when was living downtown and I got up one morning and saw that there was a piece of my fence gone. And I'm like, what is that about? Who's just like taking a slat off my fence? Well, by the time I got home from work, there was another slat gone. And then by Saturday, it was like a whole chunk of my fence. And I was like, my fence is being cannibalized. And it was like, I literally thought to myself, what do I do about a broken fence? Are there fence people? Like, do I go to Lowe's and go to the fence aisle? It just made me realize, like, I don't know a thing about fences and I don't have, and it hit me like I'm the only person in the world that has to care about this fence. And
Hmm.
it really was, it was a
Right.
very, like a marked thing about being single of like,
Yes.
wow, and not that I don't have friends and great people at church who are like, let me help you with the fence. But at the same time, it was
Mhm.
like, no one's waking up today saying, here's this fence and I have
Right.
to deal with it. That was me. So that's a
Yeah.
good point. But yeah, Matt, what would you say about adding anything more?
Yeah, that stat you gave about Gen Z, obviously a prediction, not a
Mhm.
prophecy, right?
Mhm.
But we are entering this time of what people call post-familialism, which is in the past, that was assumed that your average person would have a marriage and a family and kids and all of those things. And we're really, as a culture in the West, becoming unhinged from that. So the church does have to figure out how to pivot essentially.
Mhm.
And so just directly to your question about how a single should think through it. I mean, I think in terms of categories, broad principles. So I do believe that marriage is normative, which
Mhm.
means that most people will and should get married.
Yeah.
Now, and maybe that's not what you expect me to say as someone who's never been married. Um,
Yeah. Well, supposedly about 86% of the population will at some point be married. So that's I love just throwing out stats. So there you go.
Yeah,
There's
Yeah, we
one.
yeah.
There's one. Okay.
But like Mark said, there's all kinds of inefficiencies. There's people who desire to be married who aren't, people who desire to have kids who can't. And so
Hmm.
I think as you're sorting all of those things out, you want to make sure that's not the thing in your life that's most important to you, right?
Hmm.
You can desire something without demanding it. You
Hmm.
can long for something without it being an obsession.
Hmm.
And you figure out how to live faithfully here and now with the cards that
hmm
Providence and the Lord have dealt you.
Yeah.
hmm
Yeah. So there is, I mean, ladies, you can continue, as someone's grandma once said, to put those overalls at the bottom of your bed and pray for God to fill them. Like literally, that was said. That was said. It was a bona fide prayer. But at the same time, recognizing that, yeah, we're not going to get, we have desires, and clearly that's not always going to happen. But so that said, let's talk a little bit about singles like in the church and doing this. So Matthew, you were talking about your church being multi-generational, not a huge, we're not talking a mega church here or something. What singles that find fellowship, because I would love to get your opinion on, singles groups versus singles ministries versus integrating into the church. And I always say I love to encourage a both and, because there is an element of you've got to find your tribe. So to where Mark and Trisha, his wife,
hmm
were able to find one another. And at some point, you have people who are the people you hang out with. They're your ride to the airport. They're your chicken soup when you're sick or whatever. And sometimes, like attracts like, and you're like, these are my people. But at the same time, you can kind of devolve into some unhealthiness, maybe, if you're only around people who are just like you and you're not learning from people of other ages and stages. So, how do we reconcile this? The idea of wanting to be with people who are like us, but also maybe being like, yeah, it can't only be about me. We're not starting a sub church of just single people. So, how do you encourage singles, Matthew, to do that?
Yeah, I think this is part of a bigger conversation that we have all the time about, does the church matter?
Hmm.
hmm
Is it enough to go and commune with God in the woods and just have some Christian friends?
Right.
And when we have that conversation, one of the things I would always say to people is the point of the church is to be with people who are different from you.
Hmm.
That is one of the gifts of the church, is that you're going to be with someone who's a widow in her 80s. You're going to be with a mom who just gave birth. You're going to be with a man who's divorced. And so it is possible to lose the plot,
Hmm.
right? So we have that challenge of like, actually, this is part of the blessing of the church, is that you're rubbing elbows with all sorts of people. And so there have been times that someone's come and said, hey, I want this group of people who are just like me. And that's not all bad, right? But I will encourage them sometimes, hey, check out a group that has people who are not like you,
Hmm.
right? That's part of what it means to be a Christian.
Hmm.
We live in the West in a moment where people really have these consumeristic religious needs, right?
Hmm.
And so they come to the church and they say, will you give me this consumer product?
Hmm.
I would like to be handed community on a platter.
Hmm.
And I just sent out a letter to my congregation this month about community. And I said, hey, we actually can't give you community. We're not powerful enough to do that. What we can do is make it a little bit easier.
Hmm.
We can set up places for you to connect with other people. We can set up events where you can rub shoulders in all these different ways.
Hmm.
So I don't have a problem with single groups, and I get that people want to be with people like them, but I think we have to kind of keep first principles in front of us,
Hmm.
right? If you walk into a church and your first question is there a singles group for me?
Hmm.
I would suggest that you've lost the plot,
Hmm.
right? God's creating a new humanity in Jesus Christ.
Hmm.
Our future is people from every tribe, tongue, and nation. You're meant to be with all sorts of people who are united by the blood of the Lamb, and that needs to kind of be front and center.
Yeah. So not going in, the criticism by many singles, quite frankly, is, oh, this place is just a meat market and it's just guys swooping in and seeing who's available and whatnot. And of course, ladies, you do it too. So don't even
Yeah,
talk. So,
right.
Mark, anything to add?
No, I mean, I do think that is something valuable. You have Christian young people. It's great to have a place where they can meet other Christian young people,
Yeah.
and so it is opportunity. And sometimes even like you said with smaller churches in town, it's connecting those people from other churches, which is a
Hmm.
beautiful thing you can do. At the same time, I think you're right. I think Matthew is saying we're part of the church, and there is something beautiful about being part of people who are different. It is one of the few places where you choose to be with people who are different.
Mhm.
So now I'm an empty nester,
Mhm.
but I go to church where everybody's got little kids,
Mhm.
and so sometimes frankly it is nice to be with other empty nesters.
Mhm.
No kids always coming up every 20 seconds asking a question. But it's also something beautiful about having those relationships. And so I think it is great for church. I like that you said that having both and where singles are integrated into the life of the church, where they're using their gifts, where they're part of the community, where
Mhm.
they have married friends who can encourage them as well. And and I think there's a I think also a burden on married families too to recognize single people because they don't have you're the only one worried about your fence
Mhm.
is to integrate them into your lives too. It's easier for the family to integrate the single than it is the single to integrate the family.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
100%.
good. And it's so again, I think it is so healthy and so
mhm,
necessary. And it is great for especially singles who want to be married at some point to do life around families and be enfolded into that is so great. I feel like I always give advice to single younger adults. Maybe they'll say, well, Lisa, I'm in a church and it's great, but it's like 100 people and I'm one of two single people here. And I say, well, if it's a great church, stay plugged in and give to that church, serve in that church, be under great teaching. But maybe you can be the one to start a citywide Bible study or do something social or go to the big mega church for social things or whatever. And, it doesn't have to be like, oh my goodness, I have to leave my great, great church in order to make this happen. Because I think to
mhm,
Matthew's point, that's good. You got to, um, remember that teaching worship all of that has to stay the main
right.
thing in that. So kind of to that point as we finish out here, I would love just your hot takes on what can pastors and staffs do better to enfold singles, to see singles, to care about singles in their
Mhm.
congregations. Even if you are an empty nester, Mark, and you're like washing your hands of all these people,
Yeah.
except your own kids, you still have to worry about them.
That's
They're
right.
young adults.
That's right. That's right.
But and then conversely, what can singles do to be part of the solution and to say, hey, I'm not going to be some weird victim,
Mhm.
of this. I'm not going to be angry and bitter and yell at every pastor and every church I go to. So from where you stand, what would be your suggestions along those lines?
I'll take the family one, the pastor, and then you take what singles do differently. I think for the pastors and for just families in the church is incorporating singles in their life. So, for us, it meant, certainly at holidays having singles over. We all got to share COVID together. That was great. And,
Great.
but having them in your life, and I think for even as a family too, having them there, they're single adults who made a great impact on our kids because they were part of the family.
Mhm.
And so I think that's one thing, being intentional in including them, small groups, including them. And I think for pastors, just acknowledging that we are their family.
Mhm.
And so I think a public acknowledgement certainly could help, but I think it's up to families to really invite singles in.
Mhm. Great.
Yeah, I'd agree with everything Mark said. I'd add a couple things for church leaders. I'm passionate about making sure singles aren't overlooked in church leadership for
Mhm.
obvious reasons.
Mhm.
There's a book called Steal Like an Artist, and it says all advice is autobiographical.
Mhm.
So I actually learned this from Mark that when you have an elders meeting, you always list out who are the rising leaders in our church.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that's something I want us to be focused on, right? And that list needs to have singles on it.
Mhm.
That is, we don't, when we're looking for people to serve in the church, to lead teams, to lead out, we want to make sure that list has singles and marrieds on it. We don't want to have this prejudice of, hey, this person's not married, so they're not ready for this level of leadership in the church. In fact,
Mhm.
you're overlooking maybe some of your best leaders.
Mhm.
So that would be one thing I'd say for the church. I'd say also to ministry leaders, I think to be careful about speaking into singleness in places you don't know.
Mhm.
If you're a pastor and you got married at 22,
Mhm.
just tread lightly, right?
Mhm.
Ask more questions than it's again, all advice is autobiographical. Sometimes if a man who's married at, 21 wants to give me dating advice, that tells me more about him than it does about me. So,
Mhm.
in terms of advice for singles, I would go on what you already said, Lisa. We want to avoid this victim mindset,
Yeah.
and we want to keep the main thing the main thing.
Yeah.
So when you're picking a church, your most important question should be, hey, is this theologically orthodox, faithful to the scriptures? Are these leaders who lead this church emotionally healthy?
Mhm.
Are they actually shepherds who care for the flock? Is this a place where I can worship the living God?
Mhm.
And after you have those things discussed, after that, we can talk about, hey, are there people who are like me in this church? But we want to avoid that mindset. So I mean, I even heard a single once say, "Hey, if they don't mention singles in the congregational prayer, I'm going to lose my mind."
Mm.
And I would suggest to you, hey, if that's what you're worried about, you really have lost the plot,
Mhm.
right? We have a church around the world. If you're in Saudi Arabia, there are a grand total of 0 churches.
Mhm.
And I can guarantee you someone there is not worried about whether they're going to find a Christian their own age. They're just happy to encounter another believer.
Mhm.
And it's important for us in the West to remember that.
Yeah.
The other thing I'd say for singles is just to have high agency, right? It's tempting, like I said, to show up to a church with these consumeristic expectations of, I need to come to the church and they already have the singles group and I can just jump in and I have an automatic friend group.
Mhm.
That might happen at a few churches.
Mhm.
And a lot of places, you're going to need to go around and find the other singles and gather them together,
Sure.
right? So having that high agency mindset, being a problem solver, not a problem finder, I think is going to go a long way.
Yeah, that's cool. I do always think it's so great when marrieds are sensitive to the language they use and the way they bring singles into the conversation. I remember being at church and one guy, was standing up in my Sunday school community and was announcing dinners for 6. And he was like, so we need 3 couples per group.
Yeah.
And afterwards I went and I was like, hey, dude, there's some of us who are single. And he's like, oh my goodness, I can't even believe it. And it was so obvious that he just didn't think of it. But I didn't have to get all weirdly confrontational with him about like, you're such a jerk, and stuff. But like after that, never again did he make that mistake. And he was super great about like, hey, and who are the singles here who are going to be part of this, or we'd love for you to help lead. So that was awesome. I did have a women's event I was at where a precious woman next to me said, do you have kids? And I was like, no. And she said, are you married? And I said, no. And she said, well, honey, you just keep praying because I was 25 before I got married. And so I hung in there and you can too. And I was probably like 34 at the time. So I was just like, oh man, whatever. Okay. But it was just so cute. I wrote an article about that. So it was really fun. We had a great conversation related to that. So, well, really encouraging thoughts, you guys. I appreciate that. And again, I think it's great for us to keep the conversation going and open. And again, that whole idea of, man, what does it look like for you to be the one maybe to extend the invite as a single person? If you're listening, again, you can be the person that's the inviter, that's the enfolder, that can be the initiator of a lot of things, and use your giftedness and reach out. There are some maybe married couples and families who are drowning, and you can be an encouragement to them. So, guys, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.